Hey guys, tonight we slip into a fur-lined bed in a darkened turf house on the edge of a windswept Icelandic plain. Sometime around the year 1150. The floor is packed earth. The roof leaks a little when the ice melts. You're curled next to your spouse, maybe your third, maybe someone you barely knew before the wedding, and you're exhausted. You've shoveled snow, repaired sheep fences, hauled fish guts, maybe dodged a Viking raid or two. You're just about to drift off when a heavy silence sets in. Then the voice beside you cuts through the dark. We haven't had sex in over a week. You mumble something about being tired. Wrong answer. Because here, in this creaky, heat-starved farmhouse, you're not just risking a frosty bed, you're risking a lawsuit. In medieval Iceland, withholding sex from your spouse wasn't just selfish, it was illegal. As in, actually codified in law illegal. You could be taken to court, fined, humiliated. And yes, neighbors might whisper about your performance. If you're too tired tonight, that's understandable. But just know, you might not survive this century's version of a sexy Cold War. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Bonus points if it's past midnight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a world where lava fields stretch like broken skin across the land, and boiling geysers shoot steam into the air like the earth itself is trying to scream. The winters are endless, and the summer nights never quite go dark. Life is brutal. Food is uncertain. Warmth is a luxury, and privacy is more of a theory than a fact. So what do you do to survive? You make alliances. You form marriages not for love, not usually, but for land, cattle, political leverage, and maybe, if you're lucky, the chance to sleep next to someone who doesn't smell like cod. But those alliances come with fine print. Because marriage here isn't just a social arrangement. It's a legal contract. A sexual contract. In Icelandic law codes, if your spouse denies you intimacy without a good excuse, you can take them to court. You can demand compensation. You can walk up to the local law speaker and say, "Hey, my husband hasn't touched me since the harvest." And that could actually hold legal weight. And here's the twist. It cuts both ways. Yes, mostly it's husbands grumbling about neglectful wives, but occasionally, it's the other way around, and when it is, things get truly awkward. You rub your eyes and try to imagine this. The laws are written in animal blood and pressed onto calfskin. They sit heavy in the minds of men who spend winters memorizing the sagas, reciting tales of warriors and witches by firelight. And yet, right next to those stories of feuds and frostbite, is a clause that says, if a man does not satisfy his wife sexually, she may seek redress. That's not a joke. That's law. As real as any land grant or murder trial. If you think HR complaints in the office are awkward, try delivering a legal summons to someone because they didn't make you moan. Now, let's get tactile. The bedroom, if you can even call it that, is a communal space. You don't really have a room of your own. Your bed is a straw-filled mattress on a shared platform, maybe separated from the rest of the family by a curtain or a low wall. Your parents, siblings, maybe even your children sleep just feet away. You learn to whisper, or not. Sex is often a group-herd activity, and in that environment, the absence of noise is just as revealing as the presence of it. That's how your neighbor's aunt knew something was wrong in your marriage last month, because the sheep bleated more than you did. Of course, this legal insistence on sex isn't about personal pleasure. Medieval lawmakers weren't trying to boost anyone's self-esteem. The obsession with marital sex had more to do with property, paternity, and the orderly transfer of inheritance. If a woman didn't get pregnant, people started asking questions. Was the husband defective? Was she stepping out? Were demons involved? Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced with strict consistency or more like medieval, performative gestures, symbolic scarecrows, designed to uphold a shaky patriarchy. But here's the thing: laws reflect anxieties. And this. 1. It's a dead giveaway. Icelanders were worried. Worried about reproduction, about legitimacy, about the fragile continuity of names and lands. And sex was at the center of all that. That's why it was written into Grogus, the legendary Grey Goose Laws of Iceland. Not buried in footnotes either. Up front, like a kitchen knife on a butcher's table. Now imagine being summoned to the local Winga gathering where laws are recited, disputes are heard, and reputations are flayed like fish. You're standing there, clutching your cloak, trying not to look embarrassed while your spouse lists your carnal failings before a crowd of elders. Maybe you were too tired. Maybe you were uninterested. Maybe you preferred someone else. Doesn't matter. If you broke the intimacy clause, you broke the law. And no amount of blaming bad fish or cold feet will save your dignity now. Of course, not everyone took it lying down, pun intended. Some women used these laws as leverage, manipulating situations to gain land, escape cruel husbands, or shame rivals. Others found quiet rebellion, claiming illness or divine visions as a way to dodge the nightly expectations. There's even one story, buried deep in the sagas, of a woman who feigned madness to avoid sex, babbling about spirits and shadows until her husband gave up and went celibate. Historians still debate whether that tale was real, exaggerated, or just wishful thinking committed to ink. And what about you? You're lying there, heart pounding, wondering if your marriage bed is now a courtroom, wondering if you're fulfilling your obligation, wondering if the person beside you is about to build a legal case based on your snoring patterns. It's funny, in a bleak sort of way. Sex, the one thing you thought was private, is now as public as your taxes. But don't worry. We've only just begun. We're going to crawl through sagas, peek into law scrolls, and eavesdrop on the pillow talk of 1,000 years ago. You'll meet lusty bishops, clever wives, angry in-laws, and laws so specific they make modern HR handbooks look vague. You'll hear about love that defied expectations, and sex that fulfilled legal duties with all the romance of a tax audit. And along the way, you'll start to wonder, who really had the power here? Was it the lawmakers, the lovers, or the quiet rebels who found loopholes in lust? The moment you realize that marriage in medieval Iceland wasn't built on love but on land, livestock, and legacy, something shifts in your gut. You stop thinking of it as romantic and start seeing it as strategic, like merging two family-run startups that also occasionally share a bed. Picture two families meeting by firelight, thick wool cloaks thrown over their shoulders, each side measuring the other's worth in sheep, butter, and usable sons. And in the middle of this trade agreement, maybe you're the daughter being offered, or maybe you're the son expected to seal the deal. Either way, your body is a bargaining chip. Your libido, a legally relevant asset. Welcome to marriage, Icelandic style. Now you may be wondering how these marriages were formed in the first place. Forget love letters or moonlit walks. Your future partner was likely chosen for you based on landholdings, bloodlines, and feuding history. Fathers negotiated terms with all the enthusiasm of traders at a sheep market. A good match could stop a blood feud. A bad one might reignite one. And once the handshakes were done and the feast cleared, the expectation was clear: consummation must occur. Not just to satisfy tradition, but because a marriage wasn't considered valid until sex had happened. And yes, there were witnesses. The day after the wedding, a female family member might inspect the bedclothes for evidence. Think about that. Your honeymoon had a report card. If you failed, there were legal consequences. It's not that people were obsessed with the act itself. They were obsessed with what it confirmed: legitimacy. The logic went like this: if the marriage was consummated, then future children from the union were legitimate. If not, well, time to renegotiate. This wasn't about passion. It was about property. Children weren't just loved. They were inheritance vectors. And if there was any doubt about paternity, it could collapse entire estates. That's why, if someone whispered that your spouse had not lain with you, it wasn't just gossip, it was a grenade lobbed at your family's standing. And since marriage was essentially a contract, sexual access became one of its clauses. That's where the weird legal tangle starts to tighten. Refuse to perform your duties regularly and without good cause, and you could be sued. Picture yourself summoned before the local assembly while a neighbor with a memorized copy of Sagas recites your alleged bedtime laziness. You try to explain that you had a fever, that the fish harvest was overwhelming, that your back hurt, but the court doesn't care about feelings. The court wants to know, did you or did you not fulfill your spousal obligation? This wasn't entirely one-sided, though. There's a fascinating sex story buried in Sex with Kings that touches on queens and noblewomen who use this same logic in reverse. If their royal husbands strayed too far or ignored them for too long, some noblewomen threatened legal retaliation, not out of emotional betrayal, but because public neglect could undermine their status. Now apply that same energy to Icelandic women, some of whom were incredibly shrewd in navigating this system. If a husband was consistently uninterested or physically incapable, the wife could complain. Sometimes she'd bring a female relative or local matron to attest to her neglect. That's right, there were witnesses for everything. Sex was supposed to be both routine and trackable. What's even wilder is that there were timelines involved. Some regions considered it grounds for complaint if a spouse withheld sex for more than a few weeks. You get a sudden image of a Viking man checking his calendar nervously, realizing he's overdue and might be legally liable. This was weirdly a world of scheduled intimacy. Of course, not everyone played by the rules. The erotica scholar Peter Webb notes that some couples developed informal arrangements, open marriages of sorts, where discretion was key but infidelity was tolerated, especially during long sea voyages or pilgrimages. That meant if you were left behind for a winter, you might seek companionship from a neighbor's bored spouse or a wandering skald. And yes, this too was semi-legally recognized if done with the right level of subtlety. Historians still argue whether this kind of informal polygamy was a cultural norm or simply the result of rural loneliness and low population density. But it happened frequently enough to be mentioned in sagas and side notes of clerical complaints. Let's talk about those clerics for a moment. Technically celibate, many of them were also deeply involved in shaping sexual laws. So you have this incredible irony where unmarried men who vowed chastity were the ones defining what counted as a healthy sexual relationship. It's like letting vegans write the rules for a barbecue contest. They saw sex as necessary but dangerous. Essential for marriage, disastrous for the soul. Their solution? Regulate it. Get it in writing. Normalize it through ritual. That's how you end up with laws so detailed they read like bedtime instructions. When sex must occur, how often, and what counts as refusal. You're probably imagining all this from the modern lens of privacy and agency. But here's the kicker. These laws weren't designed to oppress one gender exclusively. They were designed to maintain social order, even if that meant policing bedsheets. The societal fabric was woven with threads of obligation, and sex was just another thread, no more sacred than a boundary stone or sheep brand. And yet, amid all this structure, there were always loopholes. A farmer might fake illness. A wife might feign visions of saints. A couple might pretend at night to fulfill the law and sleep back to back in silence. There's a fringe tidbit about one couple who claimed divine intervention had absolved them from the need to have sex. They were taken seriously for about a week, until someone noticed the wife was mysteriously pregnant. That scandal ended with a sheep fine and some very awkward silence at the next village feast. But the core idea remains: sex was a duty, an obligation, a legal pillar. And if you neglected it, you didn't just risk loneliness, you risked losing land, status, or custody of your children. You trudge through this landscape now with new eyes. Every hut you pass is a courtroom. Every bet a contract. Every silence a potential accusation. And through it all, the wind never stops screaming across the plains like a gossip with endless breath. So here you are, ankle deep in slush, shoulders sore from hauling driftwood, and your spouse, let's call them Odd for tonight, just served you a verbal subpoena under the fur blanket. You're not meeting your marital obligations, and Odd is not amused. At first, you think they're joking. But then comes the mention of the wing, the local court. And now suddenly, you're no longer in a lover's spat, you're in legal jeopardy. Because in medieval Iceland, refusing to sleep with your spouse didn't just risk a few nights on the cold side of the bed. It could get you fined, shamed, and legally disgraced. You roll over, still trying to process how your bedroom has become a courtroom. Welcome to the strange world of sex strikes and the legal risks they carried. This isn't some abstract threat. The law codes, particularly Gragas, are chillingly specific. If one partner refuses sex without just cause, and continues to refuse it, the other can bring them before the court. Just cause might include illness or spiritual penance, but even those came with expiration dates. Fake it too long, and people started asking questions. The law essentially asked, are you fulfilling your reproductive duties? If not, you're in breach of marital contract. It's part conjugal visit, part civil service. You could say no, sure, but not for long, and not without consequences. The punishments varied. In some cases, it was a fine paid to the aggrieved spouse's family. In others, a court-mandated separation or even annulment. But the real penalty was public shame. Imagine everyone at the spring gathering finding out you'd been brought to court because you were unavailable. Your nickname might go from Bjorn the blacksmith to Bjorn the frigid overnight. And in a society where reputation was your resume, that could ruin you. There's an eerie example from the history of sexuality where a woman, frustrated by years of neglect, took her husband to court not just to shame him, but to gain property rights. Since he had failed to fulfill his marital duties, she argued, the contract was broken, and therefore, she deserved land compensation. She won. That story floated across regions like a campfire ghost tale, half warning, half inspiration. And the rumor was that afterward, her husband tried to seduce the neighbor's daughter to prove he was still capable. Spoiler, she laughed in his face. These lawsuits weren't as rare as you'd think. While most couples sorted things privately, the threat of court action loomed like a winter storm, silent, slow building, and deadly. And it wasn't just about physical sex. The refusal itself symbolized disrespect, disinterest, or worse, infidelity. That's right, saying no too often could be interpreted as sleeping with someone else. It sounds like a reach, but in a culture that prized patterns of behavior, deviation was suspicious. Too much abstinence? Maybe you were satisfying yourself elsewhere. Too many excuses? Maybe you were looking to end the marriage. In fact, refusal could be legal grounds for divorce, if persistent and well documented. Think about what that meant practically. If you were on the receiving end of a cold marriage, you started keeping track, mentally noting the days, the refusals, the tone of voice. You might even confide in a friend or relative, planting a seed for future testimony. It became a quiet performance of evidence gathering, and everyone knew it. Historians still argue whether these sex-based lawsuits were primarily driven by real intimacy concerns, or by larger strategic motives, land, alliances, even revenge. But let's be honest, it was probably both. For some, it was about feeling unloved, For others, it was about ensuring children, heirs, and stability. And for a few, it was about humiliation as currency. If you could publicly shame someone, especially a powerful someone, for neglecting their spouse, you shifted power in your favor. There's a fringe tidbit from a saga fragment where a woman used a courtroom sex complaint to deflect attention from her brother's theft. She accused her husband of celibacy, drew all eyes to the scandal, and by the time the court had finished debating pillow ethics, her brother was long gone with 3 stolen goats and a forged land deed. Brilliant. But beneath all this legal choreography is a truth both strange and tender. People wanted to matter to each other. Even within the rigid legal structures, these were real marriages with real emotional landscapes. Some spouses genuinely hurt when they were refused. Others felt powerless and trapped. And when legal recourse was the only option left, they took it, not out of malice, always, but because there was nowhere else to go. You picture Odd again, maybe now with softer eyes. They weren't trying to ruin you. They were trying to be seen, to be heard. The only language they had was law. And here's where things get really Icelandic. Because of the island's oral culture and small population, news spread fast and stayed long. If you were taken to court over sex, that story lived on for generations. The legal records were sung into the sagas. Your name, yes, yours might be linked forever to one very awkward winter. And you thought modern gossip was cruel. Interestingly, this environment also fostered a sort of dark intimacy. Some couples would reconcile after court, having finally spoken aloud what they couldn't say in bed. There's even a romantic tinge to one recorded case where a man begged the court to delay proceedings so he could prove his devotion to his wife one last time. The judge, amused and a little scandalized, granted them one more night. Legend says it worked. They never returned to court. Historians can't agree whether that story is apocryphal, but it's stuck around for a reason. It gives the system a pulse, and that pulse matters. Because in all this talk of law and cold logic, it's easy to forget that people still longed for warmth, not just physical but emotional. The threat of legal action was rarely the first option. It was the nuclear one. But the fact that it existed meant people believed, somewhere under the layers of wool and duty, that being desired, being touched, being known, it mattered. And if it didn't happen, it hurt. So maybe tonight, under your damp blanket, you shift a little closer to Odd. Not out of obligation, but because the silence has lasted too long. And outside, the wind is howling again, carrying with it the sound of something old, and sad, and deeply human. There's a thud at the door, not a knock but a slow, deliberate palm strike against wood like someone testing how much pressure it'll take to break through. You're not alone. You weren't expecting anyone, not at this hour. And yet, outside your turf house in the freezing wind, stands the village priest, robes flapping like the wings of some ancient bat. His eyes scan the frost-covered doorway and then fix on you, not with warmth, but with an intensity that slices clean through your furs. You've just been reminded that sex isn't just a marital duty, it's a monitored ritual. By people who aren't even allowed to have it. Welcome to the wild paradox of medieval Iceland, where priests couldn't marry, couldn't legally lay with anyone, and yet wielded incredible power over what you did in your own bed. And they didn't just have opinions. They had jurisdiction. In the medieval world, especially after Christianization swept across the volcanic landscape, the church embedded itself deeply into the bones of Icelandic law. Suddenly, your once semi-private bedroom was under divine surveillance. You couldn't sleep with your spouse during Lent, Advent, or the week after giving birth. You couldn't do it standing from behind on Sundays during storms, yes, storms, or within earshot of church bells. And the clerics made sure you knew it. They wrote sermons so vivid you could smell the sulfur, warning of lusty demons who would drag you into volcanic pits for touching your wife in an unclean hour. It wasn't just sin, it was treason against the divine calendar. Imagine being exhausted from a week of hauling seal meat and gutting fish, finally curling into someone warm, only to be told the stars weren't aligned and your desire was now a ticket to hell. And here's the twist. These laws weren't just metaphorical. Violations could lead to public confession, penance, even monetary fines. It's one thing to feel guilty about sex, another to be fined 2 cows for it. And because priests were technically celibate, they often became experts in sex by proxy. Like incels with robes and authority, they dissected positions, frequencies, and moods with unsettling enthusiasm. One Icelandic cleric in the 12th century wrote extensively about how couples should avoid animalistic coupling, comparing certain acts to the mating habits of goats. You had to wonder how he knew so much about goats. Historians still argue whether these clergy were secretly indulging or simply obsessed in a repression-fueled feedback loop. But the result was the same. Shame soaked every corner of your intimacy. And yet, as bizarre as this sounds, these restrictions didn't destroy sexuality in Iceland. They made it weirder, sneakier, even more ritualized. Sex didn't stop. It just migrated into loopholes. One of the most fascinating stories from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History tells of a rural couple who wanted to avoid the church's disapproval during Lent. Their solution? They built a second hidden bed behind a false wall and timed their lovemaking to the clanging of the family butter churn. Neighbors thought they were making dairy. In truth, they were just dodging divine surveillance with craftsmanship and rhythm. And that wasn't rare. Icelanders, ever resourceful, found ways to express their desires in the cracks of religious law. Sex before marriage? Not ideal, but if you both admitted it before a priest and paid a modest fine, it could be overlooked. Did someone get pregnant out of wedlock? If the couple later married and baptized the child, the slate was half erased. These weren't just sins, they were social calculations. You played the game, confessed when caught, and kept moving. Some clerics even became reluctant allies. In remote parishes, a priest might quietly help regularize a union rather than alienate two powerful families. In one saga, a priest pretends to punish a couple for fornication by sending them on a year-long pilgrimage. In truth, he knew they were already pregnant and used the penance as cover to delay scandal. Fringe cases like that make scholars debate whether the clergy were oppressors or negotiators. The truth is, they were both. You can imagine the tension, can't you? The priest standing in your doorway, eyes flicking toward your spouse's unkempt hair, your 2 rosy cheeks, the misplaced candle wax near the hearth. He suspects. And you're standing there, pretending you just woke up, heart pounding with that primal mix of shame and defiance. Because despite everything, you still want to live, to touch, to feel. And you don't want to ask permission. That feeling of being watched, judged, but also stubbornly alive pulses through the sagas. Erotic tales wrapped in metaphor became a kind of quiet resistance. People told stories of shape-shifting lovers, of trolls who seduced travelers with songs, of farmhands who disappeared into the mist with milkmaids and returned smiling. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were coded rebellions. Because when the church tried to nail sexuality to a calendar, the people turned to folklore to keep it moving. And sometimes, they turned the judgment right back. In one tale, a priest who lectures villagers about chastity is later caught in a barn with a widow and 3 casks of ale. The story ends not with his punishment, but with a toast in his honor. Even the church couldn't entirely kill Icelandic humor. You pull your cloak tighter, listening to the priest's footsteps fade into the snow. You're safe for now. But the rules still linger. They're etched in your bones and in the whispers of your neighbors. Tonight might not be the night for rebellion. But the thought simmers. Because no matter how many laws they passed, how many sermons they preached, the desire didn't die. It went underground. And under the turf of your home, in the space between duty and hunger, the warmth still spreads. You wake to the creak of the floorboards and the unmistakable sound of someone slipping out the front door at dawn barefoot. Quiet, with the kind of practiced silence that only comes from routine. It's not you, it's your spouse. And no, they're not going to fetch water. You know where they're going. Everyone knows where they're going. There's a farmstead, a few hills over, with a widow who makes medicinal mead and keeps her doors open longer than any respectable woman should. But she's not running a brothel, not officially. That's the beauty of it. In medieval Iceland, prostitution was technically outlawed, but it flourished anyway, tucked into loopholes and disguised in euphemism. Brothel-like houses existed, but they were usually just regular homes with extra hospitality. Payment came in the form of favors, fish, or livestock, never coins. That would have made it illegal. But a goat for a night of company? Entirely negotiable. It wasn't just about transactional sex. It was about plausible deniability. Everyone pretended. Everyone knew. And that's where things get deliciously complicated. Because this wasn't just cheating, it was a cultural ritual. People had open marriages before we had the term. And often, these arrangements were semi-formal. If a husband was out at sea for 3 months, it was understood that his wife might find comfort elsewhere, especially in the coldest parts of winter. If she was discreet, it wasn't a scandal. If he came back with an extra set of boots and a slightly thicker coin purse, she didn't ask questions. There's a recorded case in one 13th century saga where a married couple actually negotiated their sexual breaks. He got his favorite farm girl during the hay season, and she got the traveling skald when he passed through. They called it hospitality rotation. Historians still argue whether this was satire or a real social norm, but the language of the saga is surprisingly practical, even affectionate. No jealousy, no drama, just an understanding. Maybe love in Iceland wasn't romantic, but it was flexible. And here's where the church just about lost its mind. Clerics wrote furious letters denouncing these heathen arrangements, claiming they invited the devil into every barn. But without central enforcement, rural families did what they needed to survive and stay warm. If that meant sharing more than soup with the neighbor, so be it. One priest even tried to exorcise a woman after she admitted to multiple partners. In one season, she reportedly spat in his face and told him the devil had better taste. That little rebellion? It made it into oral history, passed around like a joke with a punchline of freedom. But this wasn't just happening in the shadows. Sometimes, wife swaps were openly agreed upon, especially during festivals, legal assemblies, or when alliances were being forged. If two families had mutual trust, sharing a bed for a night could seal a bargain or ease political tensions. Think of it as medieval team building. Imagine being at a wing gathering, sipping sour beer while someone says, "Would you mind terribly if my cousin spent the night in your longhouse?" And everyone smiles because the real negotiation isn't about hay or cows, it's about bodies. There's even a fringe tidbit about a yearly ritual in one village where couples loaned spouses for fertility blessings. It sounds folkloric, but multiple scholars reference variants of this in their footnotes. Whether fact or exaggerated. Fantasy, it shows how blurry the lines were between intimacy and community ritual. You see it in the architecture too. Icelandic houses weren't designed for privacy. They were communal, compact, intimate. You had to either be stealthy or completely unapologetic. And since the walls were thin and gossip was thick, most people chose boldness. If you were caught in someone else's bed, your best defense was a good story. We were discussing theology was a classic. She needed warmth came next. But the best excuse, it was too dark to tell. Somehow, that one showed up in multiple saga records. Apparently, mistaken identity was a medieval favorite. But what did this mean for the actual, legal marriage? Was infidelity ever truly Punished? The answer is only when it embarrassed someone powerful. If you humiliated a chieftain by sleeping with his wife, expect blood. But if you quietly took comfort with a lonely neighbor during lambing season, you'd likely be fine. As long as no child was born and no land was disputed, the affair remained unofficial. That's the paradox. The laws were rigid, but the practice was fluid. Sex was both sacred and negotiable, illegal and inevitable. And the real crime wasn't the act, it was getting caught without a good enough cover story. This delicate balance made Icelandic sexuality a kind of social performance. You learned to play your part, to smile in public, to whisper in barns. And when the curtain lifted, everyone returned to their roles. The laws never truly ruled the bedroom, the community did. That's why so many sagas are filled with characters whose sexual lives are complex, vibrant, and full of subtext. Women seduce for survival. Men disguise lovers as servants. One man even marries a widow just to get closer to her sister. It's messy, human, alive. You sit now at the edge of your bed, wondering if your partner's absence is part of the performance. Or something deeper. You won't ask. Not yet. Because to ask is to puncture the delicate social fabric that keeps the whole illusion afloat. Instead, you wait. You listen. You make sure the hearth is warm. And when they return, hair mussed, cheeks flushed, you offer no judgment. You pour a bowl of broth and say nothing at all. Because in this land of fire and ice, love isn't fragile. It's negotiated. And sometimes it wears someone else's scent. You hear the bells before you see the cart. A rattling wooden thing, creaking under the weight of wool, butter, and a girl barely 15, eyes downcast, lips pressed thin. She doesn't speak as her father negotiates with the groom's family, doesn't flinch when they inspect her hands, her teeth, her hips, but her shoulders stiffen when the dowry is announced, because in medieval Iceland, a woman's value wasn't just in her family's wealth, but in what she had or hadn't done with her body. And if she wasn't a virgin, the price could double. Or worse, it could drop to nothing. You watch the scene unfold as if through fog, everyone pretending it's about kinship and land, when really, it's about what this girl's body can prove. Welcome to the brutal economics of the hymen. In a society where marriages were transactions and paternity was power, virginity wasn't a virtue, it was collateral. And if it turned out your bride had already lain with another, you could sue for fraud. That's right. Sexual history has grounds for legal action, and people took it seriously. Stories swirl in the sagas of brides being sent back to their families mid-wedding feast because of whispered rumors or suspicious bloodstains, or the lack thereof. And the punishment? Not always physical, but financial, reputational, deeply public. A groom who felt deceived could demand repayment of the dowry, publicly accuse the bride or her family, even take the case to court. Imagine standing before a panel of elders while someone argues over your worth, based on whether your first night was successful. You're not a woman anymore, you're an exhibit. One saga tells of a man who annulled his marriage the morning after the wedding, citing his bride's lack of resistance as proof she wasn't a virgin. The elders debated whether that meant she was simply relaxed or dangerously experienced. They decided it meant she was accustomed to male presence and ruled in the groom's favor. She was returned to her father with a goat and an apology. Not for the accusation, just for the inconvenience. Historians still argue whether these rulings reflect a widespread obsession or were limited to elite families protecting their bloodlines. But even if these were outlier cases, they reveal something essential. Female sexual behavior was commodified, documented, judged, and not just before marriage. A woman who had sex outside of wedlock could be labeled loose, a term that followed her like a smoke trail. Some women managed to rise above it, using charm, wit, or sheer power. Others were quietly married off to distant farms, or sent to nunneries, not out of piety, but to preserve the family's face. But virginity wasn't the only metric. Timing mattered too. If a woman had been betrothed, but was found to have been with someone else before the marriage was finalized, it was seen as a form of betrayal. Even worse, if she'd had sex with her betrothed before the wedding, mutual consent be damned, it could be used against her. Because pre-wedding sex implied impatience, and impatience implied lack of discipline, and lack of discipline implied she might not be faithful later. It was a domino chain of assumptions with real-world consequences. That's where it gets surreal. Because men, meanwhile, were almost never penalized for premarital sex. If anything, a man with experience was sometimes considered more desirable. He knew what he was doing. He could train a wife. The double standard wasn't just obvious, it was institutional, and it bled into legal texts. In Gragas, multiple clauses define female conduct in terms of honor and shame, but similar male behaviors are treated as youthful indiscretions. A man who sleeps around is vigorous. A woman? She's spoiled, and yet there were exceptions. Rare few women turned their sexual reputations into weapons. One tale speaks of a widow who took lovers from every corner of her valley, then refused all proposals, claiming none could match her late husband's generosity. Her defiance earned her both awe and disgust, and to this day, scholars debate whether she was a feminist icon or just very lonely. Another story tells of a young woman who, accused of not being a virgin, responded by asking if the court wanted her to regrow her hymen out of spite. The elders laughed, then dropped the case. She married a traitor the following spring. You wonder what she whispered to him that first night. But not all stories end in smirks and comebacks. Many women suffered. Accused without proof, punished. Without trial, abandoned over hearsay. Their silence fills the sagas like invisible ink. They're the ones you don't hear about. The footnotes, the lost names. You think of the girl on the cardigan, swaying as the road dips into snow. She doesn't know what her husband expects. She doesn't know if he'll be kind or cruel or just cold. She only knows she has to bleed. Because if she doesn't, someone might call it deceit. And if they do, the rest of her life could be shaped by that one missing stain. You shiver, suddenly aware of your own skin, the fragility of bodies when turned into evidence. The idea that something so intimate could be litigated, that the most personal part of someone could be measured, inspected, monetized, it lingers. Not just as history, but as warning. Because long after the laws changed and the cart stopped rolling, that idea that a woman's worth lies between her legs never fully died. It just learned to whisper. You pull the blanket tighter, as if to hide from it, but it's there, in every old tale, in every law book scrap, in every wordless scene where a girl looks down, and a man decides what that means. The ink is dark and faintly sticky, like dried blood, etched into vellum that once lived as a calf. You run your fingers across the page, feeling the subtle grooves pressed by a meticulous scribe who probably didn't realize that centuries later, someone would be scrutinizing a law about how often married couples were supposed to have sex. This isn't poetry or metaphor. This is the Gragas, one of Iceland's oldest and most revered legal codes, and nestled among its rules about property boundaries, livestock disputes, and blood feuds are regulations about your bedroom behavior. That's right. The law didn't stop at what you owned, it told you what to do under the sheets and when. Imagine opening a legal manual today and reading, spouses shall lie together at least once every week unless illness, pilgrimage, or fasting days interfere. It sounds like a joke, like something you'd find on a novelty mug. But in medieval Iceland, this was gospel. Sex wasn't just encouraged, it was expected, regulated, and woven directly into the machinery of law. It starts with the basics. Consummation must happen for the marriage to count. That's the legal baseline. But beyond that, regular sex was framed as both a marital right and a social obligation. Too long without it? That could be grounds for litigation, or worse, annulment. The law acknowledged that physical intimacy helped maintain the alliance. It reaffirmed the marriage contract. In a society built on fragile loyalties and even more fragile bloodlines, sex acted as both glue and insurance, and it wasn't left to implication. The language in some of the surviving texts is shockingly blunt. One passage reads like a conjugal schedule, outlining periods of permissibility and abstinence, correlating with feast days, fasts, and seasonal chores. Sex during holy days was discouraged. Sex during a woman's menstrual period was strictly forbidden. Sex during Lent could invite both spiritual doom and community disgust. But outside those carved-out windows, it was not only allowed, it was expected. You picture it now, a couple returning from evening prayers, staring at the law book instead of each other, counting off days like monks tracking lunar cycles. Wait, is it Thursday already? Yes, and the bishop said the new moon isn't until next week. Well then, better not risk a summons. It turns the bed into a kind of courtroom, with each partner measuring not just desire but legal risk. And don't assume it was just women being judged. The law made room for female plaintiffs. If a husband consistently refused to perform his duties without good cause, the wife could appeal to the court. She could argue that the marriage was unfulfilled, and in doing so, she could initiate a legal separation or request financial compensation. This is where things get particularly intriguing, because it means that Icelandic women, often dismissed in other European regions as passive players in marital life, had both a voice and a legal path when it came to sexual neglect. That doesn't mean they had equal power, but they weren't silent. One recorded case speaks of a woman who dragged her husband before the local assembly, accusing him of being as cold as the winter sea. Her words, not ours. She claimed that despite sharing a bed, they had not shared a night in 3 months. Her mother-in-law tried to defend the man, citing his poor health and bad dreams. But the court ruled in the wife's favor, and the man was ordered to either make good on his vows or grant her land and livestock in compensation. It's hard not to admire the clarity. But not all cases ended so cleanly. The ambiguity of proof always haunted these complaints. Could you prove neglect? Could you show frequency? In an era without diaries, text messages, or receipts, the court had to rely on testimony and gossip. And Icelanders were very good at gossip. You could almost say it was their national sport. If the neighbor's dog stopped barking at night, or if the smoke from your chimney thinned earlier than usual, people noticed, and they drew conclusions. That's how sexual reputation got tangled with legal standing. If you were thought to be too cold or too loose, it shaped how judges saw your case, and once you were labeled, it stuck. There's a fringe tidbit about a man known only as Snorri the Sleepy, who reportedly faked sleep to avoid intimacy so often that it became legend. His wife eventually sued him, claiming his snoring was strategically timed. The court laughed but ruled in her favor. Snorri was fined 2 silver rings and had to host a feast to restore his honor. No word on whether he stayed awake afterward. But here's where things get even weirder. The legal expectation of sex wasn't just about frequency, it was about location. One clause makes it clear that spouses should sleep in the same bed, unless physically prevented by illness, travel, or childbearing. Separate beds, over time, could be seen as evidence of emotional or sexual abandonment. Imagine that your furniture arrangement as courtroom testimony. Move to the guest cot too many nights in a row, and suddenly your partner has grounds to sue. It all makes you wonder, did anyone ever feel desire without legal pressure? Or did people just learn to merge affection with obligation until the two became indistinguishable? It's hard to say. Some sagas speak of couples who genuinely loved each other, who joked, flirted, and embraced with genuine affection. One tale, tucked into a lesser-known family saga, describes a woman who teased her husband by hiding his shoes on duty night, forcing him to chase her barefoot through the frost until they collapsed laughing in the hay. No court, no summons, just intimacy. But those stories are rare, and they shine brighter for it. More often, what we see are marriages maintained through routine, discipline, and law. Sex wasn't just a private act, it was a civic duty, a line item on the contract. And you start to realize how radically different that is from our modern sensibilities. Today, we imagine intimacy as spontaneous, fueled by chemistry, shielded from judgment. Back then, it was woven into the fabric of public life, expected, monitored, enforceable. You lie back, staring at the rafters, imagining the weight of those expectations pressing down like another fur blanket. You'd better sleep well tonight, because tomorrow, someone might ask whether you did. You wake up to the sound of the wind howling like it's got a personal vendetta, clawing at the turf roof with icy fingers and whistling down the chimney like a ghost complaining about its unfinished business. The fire's gone out. Your breath fogs in the dark. Beside you, your spouse lies silent, turned away, a frozen cliff where warmth used to live. You reach out, tentative, your fingers brushing fabric instead of skin. No movement, no murmur, just the ache of absence in a bed that's not truly shared. And that's when the dread hits you, slow but sharp. If this goes on much longer, it won't just be an emotional distance, it'll be a legal one. Because in medieval Iceland, your ability to perform in the bedroom wasn't just about personal satisfaction, it was your civic duty. And if you failed, that failure could annul your marriage. You think impotence today is a personal issue, maybe something to discuss with a doctor or your therapist. But in this world, it's a courtroom matter, one that could strip you of your spouse, your reputation, and depending on your status, your property. The laws were brutal in their precision. If a man was unable to perform within a set period after marriage, his wife could petition for dissolution. No shame, no delay. She simply had to present her case at the local assembly. Sometimes she'd even bring witnesses. You'd be standing there, cheeks flushed with more than cold, while a cousin or neighbor testified that they heard nothing. No moaning, no creaking boards on multiple nights. One woman reportedly brought her still pristine bridal sheets to court, unfolded them dramatically before the elders, and asked, "Do you see proof of a union here?" The court didn't. The marriage was annulled. Her former husband left the village within a week, shamed into exile. And that's not even the worst of it. Because this wasn't just about what you couldn't do. It was about why. Impotence, you see, wasn't seen as just a medical condition. It was a spiritual, moral, or even magical flaw. Maybe you'd angered a deity. Maybe someone cursed you. Maybe your wife was secretly a witch who'd tied your manhood with knots of snow. These weren't just wild rumors, they were legitimate legal arguments. If you were accused of magical impotence, you might be asked to drink a purification brew made from fermented milk, soot, and crushed sage, while the local gogi watched for signs of divine favor or vomiting. There's a fringe tidbit about a man who tried to prove his virility by mounting a horse bareback and riding it through a frozen stream. When he fell off, his wife used the incident as further proof of physical failure. The court agreed. The marriage was dissolved, and the horse later won a local race, adding insult to injury. But impotence didn't just affect men. Female pleasure, though less publicly defended, wasn't entirely invisible. A wife who found her husband unsatisfactory could claim emotional or physical neglect, and if she used the right words, the elders listened. One recorded complaint involved a woman who said her husband lay with her as one lies with cold fish. The phrasing was so vivid it made it into saga poetry. While most women didn't have the social leverage to press these complaints, some used indirect routes, enlisting brothers, uncles, or respected neighbors to advocate for them. Others wrote songs, One ballad describes a woman who spends her wedding night praying for her husband's sudden death, only to find herself widowed 2 days later when he slips on frozen dung. Coincidence? The sagas don't say. You begin to see how intimacy wasn't intimate at all. It was theater. Every movement, every murmur or lack thereof, was potential evidence. And in that charged space, performance anxiety took on a whole new dimension. How could anyone relax knowing their ability to climax might be discussed at the next spring gathering? This is where the sagas shift tone from grim to almost comedic. Tales of fumbling lovers, sudden interruptions, mistaken identities. 1 man, nervous on his wedding night, drank too much mead, accidentally crawled into the wrong bed. He woke up beside his new mother-in-law, who apparently just sighed and told him he could try again tomorrow. The court took pity on him. He got a second chance. But he never lived it down. Even today, historians still argue whether these legal prescriptions were actively enforced or served more as social pressure valves, tools to keep the community in check by making private dysfunction publicly correctable. Some scholars believe the rules were mostly symbolic, a way to maintain appearances. Others argue that cases were indeed brought, fines levied, and marriages ended because of what happened or didn't happen in the dark. But here's the thing that lingers. Behind the laws, behind the accusations and the public hearings, was real pain. Real fear. Imagine loving someone and finding that they recoiled from your touch. Imagine wanting desperately to fulfill your role but finding your body unwilling. Imagine hearing your name whispered as a failure, a half-man, a cursed soul. And imagine all of it discussed not in whispers, but under the open sky, before a semicircle of men with beards and axes, who've never talked about their feelings but now get to vote on your masculinity. You don't just lose your spouse. You lose the right to be seen as whole. You roll over now, looking at the shadow beside you. Are they awake? Are they waiting? Is tonight the night you bridge the distance, or the night they start drafting their complaint? You breathe in, slow and steady, hoping that what happens next won't be used against you. Because in this world, desire isn't private, it's law. And failure isn't just a quiet heartbreak. It's a public verdict. There's a thud in the hallway, and then a rustle, someone's awake. Someone's pacing, someone's angry. Can tell by the rhythm of the footfalls, by the deliberate slam of the door, by the silence that follows like a drawn-out inhale. You lie there, frozen beneath the wool blanket, counting the seconds. You already know what it's about. Again. The same fight, the same frustration. Because here in your turf house, the sex hasn't been soft or warm or welcome for weeks. It's been sparse, mechanical, or worse, non-existent. And this time, the anger isn't about your performance. It's about how you performed. Or rather, how violently, how selfishly, or maybe just how clumsily. In medieval Iceland, even if you were meeting the minimum legal frequency, that didn't mean you were safe from consequences. If your spouse accused you of being too rough, too forceful, or of failing to consider their comfort, they could take you to court. And if they had witnesses, or a bruise, or a good enough story, the court might believe them. Because here's the twist you didn't see coming. Even in a society that saw sex as duty and reproduction as destiny, medieval Icelandic law left room, strangely progressive room, for the idea that women were not just passive objects, but active participants in intimacy. And that their suffering mattered. You'd expect silence. You'd expect submission. And yes, in many places, in many periods, that's exactly what women were expected to give. But in Iceland's tangled knot of oral tradition, law, and saga, the wives of the island were not always so quiet. Some spoke up, loudly. They used the same laws that bound them to also bind their husbands. There are documented cases, rare but revealing, where wives accused husbands not just of neglect, but of violence, of turning the marriage bed into a battleground. One woman claimed her husband pounced like a bear and finished before the kettle boiled. The court laughed. Then fined him 2 barrels of skyer and sent him to live with his cousin until the frost broke. That kind of complaint wasn't standard, but it wasn't impossible either, especially if the woman came from a strong family or had allies in the village, or if she timed her complaint during a legal assembly when her husband's enemies were already circling. Sex, in this world, wasn't just about pleasure or duty, it was a political tool. And power didn't flow in only one direction. You see it in the sagas. There's a wife who withholds intimacy from her chieftain husband until he agrees to stop raiding a neighboring clan. Another who threatens to expose her husband's quickness unless he gives her a larger share of the summer grazing rights. These stories blur the line between bedroom and battlefield. Historians still argue whether they're based on real women or literary constructs. Either way, the message is the same. Do not underestimate the person lying beside you. Of course, not all wives had that leverage. Many were stuck in miserable marriages, especially if they came from smaller families or lacked dowry clout. And while the law might technically protect them from excessive harm, enforcement was another matter. There's a chilling story of a woman who appeared at a wing with a swollen eye and a broken tooth. She accused her husband of forcing himself on her after a feast. The elders deliberated for hours, then declared that since the couple were married, and since there had been no witnesses, the matter was inconclusive. She returned home, her silence louder than any verdict. But for every case like that, there was another, maybe smaller, maybe less violent, where a wife found her voice. Complaints about excessive nighttime visits, about bruises on the thighs, or about being woken with no warning. These phrases show up in old court records, often nestled between livestock theft and land disputes. You start to understand that the body, especially a woman's, was not entirely invisible. In the law, it wasn't sacred, no, but it was acknowledged. And in a world where acknowledgement often meant survival, that mattered. Some women pushed even further. They didn't just complain, they demanded. One rare but remarkable case involved a woman who claimed her husband's touch left her colder than the grave. She argued not only that he was inattentive, but that his behavior actively harmed her. The court ruled that he must learn to please her or release her. It's almost modern in its language. You blink reading it. How did a society so focused on duty and dynasty allow that ruling? And then you realize, Iceland, with all its cruelty and cold, also had cracks in the ice. Places where justice, however flawed, could seep through. That ruling may have been rare, but it was real. And in its realness, it changes how you view everything else. You remember that intimacy here was never private. It was shared through. Sagas, scrutinized in court, speculated about in kitchens, which means it was performative, strategic, but also malleable. Some people learned how to shape it to their advantage. Others were crushed beneath it. And somewhere in between were those who simply survived it, one night at a time. You roll over now, reaching out again, but softer this time. There's a flicker of movement, a breath caught mid-sigh. Maybe it's not too late to fix things. Maybe it's not just about law and obligation and bruises on thighs. Maybe it's about learning how to be warm in a world that's always been cold. Outside, the wind shifts, the stars blink. You hold your breath. And wait, the candle sputters, casting nervous shadows against the wooden beams above your head. You lie still, not because you're tired, but because you're listening for the voice that always begins the same way, with a low hum, like someone warming up before slipping into something ancient and dangerous. It's the oldest kind of bedtime story, a saga passed from grandmother to child, from lover to lover, a tale where myth and memory blur. And tonight, the voice is speaking of saints and seduction, of spirits who enter through the smoke hole and leave laughter and longing in their wake. You can't help but smile, because in this tale, sex isn't just duty, it's destiny. Icelandic folklore is a strange beast, part sermon, part soap opera, and fully drenched in desire. Despite the cold, the isolation, the austere reputation of its people, medieval Iceland had a rich tradition of erotic storytelling. Not bawdy in the crude tavern sense, but earthy, sharp, and weirdly tender. These weren't stories told to titillate, they were stories told to make sense of longing in a land that often felt godless. You hear one now. It's about a saint, half real and half imagined, who travels the fjords converting pagans not with fire or sword, but with irresistible charm. He kisses a girl by a glacier and she sees the Virgin Mary. He touches a widow's hand and her cows start producing double. He's not just a holy man, he's divine aphrodisiac. Women dream of him, men curse him. The church, of course, hates him. He's a folk response to all the repression. A character born from years of being told that touch was sin, that lust was punishment. He walks through stories like a protest in robes. Then there's the saga of the girl who refused every suitor until a shapeshifter came in the form of her dead dog. Yes, you heard that right. The dog-turned-man was gentle, understanding, knew her dreams before she spoke them. They lived together for a year before he melted into mist. Some scholars say it's a metaphor for grief. Others say it's about the kind of love society never allows. But the subtext is always there. Pleasure is power, and forbidden's pleasure is the most powerful of all. You start to notice how often transformation accompanies desire in these stories. Trolls seducing shepherd boys, sea spirits pulling lovers into the surf, wives who turn into swans to escape bad husbands. Sex isn't just physical here, it's supernatural. And in a culture where the physical was regulated by law, the mythic became the only safe place to explore longing. That's why even the saints got horny. In one tale, a bishop prays so hard to avoid lust that his body detaches from his urges, leaving his desires to roam the village causing chaos. The desires, now disembodied, flirt with every maiden and milkmaid in sight. The bishop finally has to bargain with them to return, offering 3 days of indulgence in exchange for peace. It's both hilarious and heartbreaking, because behind the absurdity is a truth. Repression never erases desire. It just makes it strange, and Icelandic sagas leaned into that strangeness. There's a fringe tidbit about a man who claimed to have fallen in love with a lava formation. He visited it nightly, left it offerings, even sang to it. When villagers mocked him, he declared the rock had more warmth than any wife. Months later, the rock was struck by lightning and split open. Inside, a perfectly shaped chamber. Locals called it the lover's bed. Coincidence or cosmic punchline? Historians still argue, but one thing's clear. People were willing to find intimacy in anything that gave them freedom. Even stone. And then there were the ghost stories. Spectral lovers who returned from the dead to finish what they'd started. One saga speaks of a bride who died before her wedding night, only to appear weeks later beside her husband, silent but demanding. They lay together every night for a month until he died smiling. The locals buried them together with a stone, etched with the words, "Love needs no breath." You wonder what those stories meant to the people hearing them. Maybe they were comfort, maybe they were warnings, but maybe, just maybe, they were escape. Because when the law said sex was mandatory and the church said it was dangerous, folklore stepped in to say, it's both, it's everything. It's messy and divine and uncontrollable. It belongs to no one and everyone. You sit up now, blinking into the dark, wondering what stories your own ancestors told to survive their silences. Maybe they whispered of saints who kissed too long. Maybe they sang about trolls who asked permission. Maybe they found, in myth, the intimacy they never dared pursue in life. The wind rattles the door again, like a lover tapping one last time. Before slipping away, you lie back down, eyes wide, heart slow. And somewhere outside, or maybe deep within the folds of your memory, the voice starts again, low and soothing, telling you of another woman who ran into the mountains to avoid marriage only, to return pregnant with a song instead of a husband. She raised her child alone, taught him to listen to birds, and when asked who the father was, she simply said, "A man who understood the wind." You think about that woman. You think about what it means to choose silence over shame, mystery, over law, and you start to see why so many Icelandic stories are both erotic and tragic. Because they know that in this world, pleasure always has a price, but some are still willing to pay it. The sheep are louder than usual tonight, restless in the wind, bleating like they've heard something you haven't. The cold has sharpened, the kind of brittle chill that snaps wood and stiffens bones. Wrap your cloak tighter, but it doesn't help not when the air inside the turf house is nearly as cold as the outside. Your fingers are numb, your nose drips, and in the corner, your spouse is methodically stacking wood, eyes glazed over with the kind of fatigue that comes from surviving more than living. And somehow, impossibly, beneath all this, you're expected to want sex, not just want it. Provide it, deliver it, sustain it like firewood and dried fish. Because here in medieval Iceland, even desire had to learn how to shiver. It's easy to forget how much the climate shaped the intimate rhythms of people's lives. With winter stretching 8 months and nights swallowing whole days, the concept of mood lighting was replaced by whale oil lamps and the sound of frost cracking. Across the earth, there were no baths to prepare you, no privacy to seduce you, and no central heating to make skin feel like anything but regret. You didn't undress. You rearranged layers. And foreplay was mostly about whether the goat manure had been cleared out of the main room. And yet somehow it happened. It had to, not just for legal reasons, but for survival. Because during the long winters, the body wasn't just a source of reproduction, it was warmth. Your partner's skin became your second cloak, your shared breath, a makeshift furnace. The bed, narrow and scratchy, was still the warmest place in the house, and it demanded sharing. But warmth didn't always mean tenderness. Sometimes it meant resentment, fatigue, obligation. There are tales of couples who didn't speak for weeks, but still lay together every night, backs touching, pretending sleep as an excuse for silence. Their children were conceived in half-dreams, not moans. Other times, sex became escape, a way to feel alive when everything else felt numb. Scholars note an uptick in birth records about 9 months after major storms or crop failures. One historian jokes that Icelandic babies were made in direct proportion to how hopeless the harvest seemed. When in doubt, people reached for each other, not out of romance, but because the alternative was staring into darkness and waiting for the ice to crack. And yet, there were those who managed to find joy. One folk story tells of a couple who made a game of seduction, hiding under hay to steal moments together, whispering promises in the dark. They called it chasing warmth, and it became their ritual. Every night, a new hiding place. Every night, a new reason to seek. Their neighbors thought them eccentric. Their children called them strange. But they lived longer than anyone else in the valley, and when they died, they were buried in the same blanket. You wonder if anyone mocked them in court, if anyone dared. But for every warm story, there are 10 that chill. Women who gave birth alone in the dark, their husbands too drunk or too distant. Men who collapsed from frostbite after spending the windy night in barns because their wives had grown tired of their demands. A saga mentions a man named Horir who came home one night, soaked from a blizzard, expecting comfort. His wife handed him a bowl of cold soup and went back to spinning wool. He sued her for neglect. She countered by listing every time he had touched her without speaking first. The court dismissed both claims. No one won. The weather had beaten them both. But the most heartbreaking stories come from the silences. The missing entries in the sagas, the marriages that left no children, The beds that stayed cold. The women who stopped speaking. Historians still argue whether the emotional coldness in some regions was due to climate or culture, but most agree on one thing. Iceland taught people how to endure, not necessarily how to connect. Sex was not always passion. Often, it was protocol. A scheduled exchange beneath the weight of furs, without eye contact or conversation. One woman, in a rare surviving letter fragment, wrote, "He does not see me, only what I must give." That line echoes louder than any saga. And yet there were rebels. People who fought the frost with fire. Who demanded more than routine. Who believed that even in a land of stone and silence, the body could still be a source of light. One man composed erotic poetry for his wife every solstice, hiding verses in her sewing kit. One woman carved the shape of her lover's hand into a soapstone and wore it beneath her dress for years. These acts weren't just romantic, they were revolutionary. Because in a culture where sex was law, to make it love was defiance. You breathe in now, feeling the draft at your feet, the aching pull of exhaustion behind your eyes. And yet, part of you longs for that warmth, not the shared bed, not the expected rhythm, but the moment before it, when the cold recedes and skin remembers softness. When two people find each other not because they must, but because they still can. The sheep finally settle. The wind quiets. Your spouse slides into bed beside you, careful, hesitant. A hand finds yours beneath the blanket. Nothing is said. But maybe, just maybe, tonight isn't about duty. Maybe tonight is about survival in its gentlest form. Not fire, not passion, just two bodies refusing to freeze. You hear them before you see them, murmurs slicing through the mist, laughter. That doesn't belong to you. A door creaking open when no one knocked. The turf walls don't keep secrets well. They absorb voices and release them like breath, muffled but unmistakable. It's late, but no one sleeps, not really. Because, in medieval Iceland, privacy isn't a right. It's a rumor. You live in a single room, maybe with a low wall to separate the livestock from the humans. Maybe with a heavy curtain around the bed if you're lucky. Most likely, you share your sleeping space with children, siblings, visiting cousins, or hired hands. And that means everyone knows everything. Or at least, they think they do. Gossip is the second most reliable currency in the village, right behind fish. And when it comes to intimacy, speculation is just another form of storytelling. You turn your head on the straw pillow listening. Two voices, familiar, close. It's not their words that stay with you, it's the rhythm. The unmistakable pattern of closeness. The inhale-pause-exhale of a conversation that only happens in darkness. You close your eyes not because you're tired, but because you don't want to know what happens next. Because once you know, you become part of the tale. And in this culture, tales are everything. Iceland's oral traditions didn't just preserve genealogies and sagas, they preserved scandals. If a man stayed too long at a widow's house, someone noticed. If a woman's laughter changed pitch when a certain traveler passed through, someone remembered. There are stories of affairs told through firelight whispers, of lovers caught when their boots didn't match the mud outside, of broken marriages sealed not by violence, but by silence. And once the tale began, it was impossible to stop. A neighbor's comment here, a sideways glance there, and suddenly your marriage is under review by the village. You don't need a courtroom. You have an audience. And that audience can be merciless. One saga tells of a couple whose love life became the favorite topic at the local bathhouse. The wife was said to be too vocal, the husband too eager. Strangers would imitate their supposed sounds, turning their intimacy into a comedy routine. Eventually, the couple left the village, not from shame, but from exhaustion. They'd become folklore while still alive, and that's not rare. In a world without locks, doors, or personal space, performance becomes survival. You learn to modulate your moans, To time your passion for when the house is loudest, maybe during a feast, maybe during a thunderstorm. You learn to hide affection in plain sight. A hand passed behind a water jug, a glance too long across the dinner bench. You become an actor in your own life, trying to protect something as fragile as closeness in a place where even the wind has ears. There's a fringe tidbit about a woman who trained her parrot to mimic kissing sounds. She'd let it chirp all night just to confuse the neighbors. It worked for years until the parrot accidentally confessed during a church sermon. True or not, the story remains because it makes people laugh, but also because it tells the truth. People would go to wild lengths to preserve illusion. And illusion, in this society, is everything. You could have the most devoted spouse, the most passionate nights, but if your neighbor thinks you're distant, that becomes your truth. If your rival starts a rumor about a late-night visit from a skald, you wear that story like a cloak, whether it's yours or not. The public and private bleed into each other like ink on sheepskin, and you're constantly redrawing the lines. That's why houses weren't just homes, they were stages. The main room was your living room, kitchen, bedroom, courtroom, and theater. If you slept too quietly, people wondered. If you laughed too loudly, people wondered. If your child didn't resemble your spouse, people wondered. And once they started wondering, they never stopped. Historians still argue whether this public intimacy helped or harmed marriages. Some say it created pressure forcing couples to perform love instead of live it. Others argue it fostered accountability, that being visible made people try harder. Maybe both are true, maybe none. But what's clear is that privacy was rare and precious. Some couples developed codes. 3 coughs meant not tonight. A knock on the bedframe meant later. Some invented reasons to leave the house. Slipping into barns or caves or fish-drying sheds for stolen moments. There's one tale about a pair who met under a waterfall every new moon. The water drowned out the noise, and the risk made it sweeter. They kept the secret for a decade. When they were finally discovered, the village expected shame. Instead, the couple simply laughed. "You waited 10 years to catch us," the wife said. "That's on you." But not all stories end in laughter. Some end in exile. One man was cast out after rumors claimed he'd seduced both a married woman and her daughter. No proof. Just whispers that got louder until the silence became unbearable. He walked into the mountains and never came back. They say the woman died a year later, of shame or something like it. Her daughter married a traitor and never spoke of it again. And still, the story is told. Not because it's true, but because it could be. You lie back now, hearing the house creak with memories. You wonder how many stories have been told about you half true, quarter true, not true at all. You wonder how many whispers have shaped your reality. And whether, in some corner of the island, your name has already become a punchline. Or a poem, because in medieval Iceland, nothing stays hidden. Not love, not betrayal. Not even the sound of breath catching in the dark. You take your partner's hand, slowly, gently, as if to say, let them listen. And somewhere behind the turf walls, someone leans closer. The steam rises like a ghost between your fingers, curling in lazy spirals before vanishing into the rafters. You sit naked on the stone bench, water trickling off your back, your knees pulled to your chest, and across from you, someone watches. Not in a leering way, but openly, curiously, as if trying to remember the shape of your shoulders for a story they'll tell later. This is the bathhouse. And in medieval Iceland, it's not just where you clean yourself. It's where everything private becomes public. Your body, your marriage, your secrets, all exposed in the haze of heat and human proximity. You'd think nudity would bring shame, but it doesn't. Not here. Not in a world where clothing is armor and exposure is honesty. In the bathhouse, you strip off the wool, the leather, the layers of dirt and expectation. What's left is raw, vulnerable, and surprisingly, social. People talk here, really talk. It's where deals are made, alliances hinted at, flirtations begun. One saga even describes a man proposing marriage while scrubbing his own armpits. Another tells of a woman who rejected a suitor mid-bath by splashing him and saying, "You smell of old sheep and false promises." He left dripping and humiliated. But beyond the jokes, there's tension. Because in these steamy rooms, modesty doesn't protect you. What protects you is wit, confidence, control. You learn to own your body because everyone can see it. And if they see fear, they'll use it. The bathhouse is also where suspicion is born. Where people notice bruises not explained by chores. Where a woman's silence says more than her words. Where a man's downcast eyes betray a guilty conscience. It's in this public-private blur that social enforcement thrives. The bathhouse becomes a confessional without the forgiveness. There's a recorded story of a young wife who stopped visiting the bathhouse. People noticed. Whispers started. Was she ashamed of something? Hiding marks? Avoiding someone? Within weeks, her marriage was under scrutiny. Her husband, defensive and angry, accused her of infidelity. She accused him of cruelty. The court believed neither fully, but the community remembered everything. She moved to a different valley. He never remarried. The bathhouse, in essence, was a surveillance tool. But unlike a courtroom, it didn't require testimony, just presence. You showed up, or you didn't. You acted natural, or you didn't. And in a culture obsessed with appearances, those tiny behaviors became social facts. And yet, there's something liberating here too. For all its risks, the bathhouse offers a rare space where gender boundaries blur. Men and women often bathed separately, but not always. Mixed bathing happened more than you'd think, especially during festivals or harvest celebrations. And in those moments, the body was no longer taboo. It was just another part of the human condition. There's a fringe tidbit about a festival in western Iceland where, once a year, the entire community bathed together in a large hot spring, singing old songs and sharing fermented milk. No one spoke of what happened after, but births in the spring always ticked up. The bathhouse was also where young people learned about sex, not from books, but from overheard conversations, from the shifting glances between lovers, from the half-covered bruises of passion or punishment. A girl might hear her aunt murmur about how to quiet a rough man. A boy might catch the tail end of a joke about when to fake a moan. It was unfiltered education, no diagrams, just anecdotes, soaked in steam and secondhand shame. And still, you wonder, was there privacy anywhere? Was there any place where intimacy was untouched by audience? Maybe, in caves, in hidden groves, in dreams. One lover's tale speaks of a couple who met only in the mist, speaking no words, leaving no trace, until one of them disappeared into marriage. The surviving lover returned to the bathhouse every month, hoping for a glimpse. They bathed in silence, watching every new visitor, waiting for a familiar shoulder, a scar, a breath. They died still waiting. Their story became a poem. You run a hand over your leg, watching the steam dance. Across from you, someone shifts. Not aggressively, not awkwardly, just present. Noticing. You wonder what they're thinking. What they'll say about you later. And whether it matters. Because in this space, you cannot hide. You can only perform or own. And if you're lucky, perhaps you find someone who sees the difference. The steam thickens. The door creaks open. Another figure steps in, shedding their cloak, their boots, their mask. You turn away. Not out of shame, but because sometimes letting someone be unseen is the greatest gift of all. The fire crackles low, casting long orange fingers across the wooden beams as a silence settles over the room. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that waits for someone to speak first. You're sitting shoulder to shoulder with 3 other people at the edge of a low bench. Your back stiff, your palms sweaty. your breath caught somewhere between your throat and your stomach. Across from you, a father, a brother, and a friend are watching your every move. Tonight isn't a feast or a gathering. Tonight is a courtship by appointment. Because in medieval Iceland, love didn't just happen. It was structured, negotiated, and above all, timed. The rules were clear. From the moment you made your intentions known formally, with a gift or a spoken claim, you had 1 year, 1 year to prove yourself, to build favor with the family, to avoid scandal. 1 year to win your way into a marriage, or to be politely or not so politely dismissed. It sounds harsh, but it made a kind of sense. Time, after all, was precious. Winters were long, summers were a flurry of survival. No one had space for endless flirtation. If you wanted someone, you made it known. You staked a claim not just on their affection, but on their economic and social value. And the countdown began. That's how you ended up here, elbows tucked in, voice rehearsed, trying not to spill your ale while explaining your intentions. It's not that you love them. Not yet. Love is a luxury, something that might grow, if you're lucky. But right now, this is about compatibility. About dowries and grazing rights and whether your ancestors were on the right side of that old blood feud 3 valleys over. It's about timing. And the clock is ticking. The idea of the 1 year rule might seem strange now, almost transactional. But in this world, it was an act of mercy. It gave both parties time to assess, to prepare, to escape. If, at the end of the year, the marriage wasn't sealed, if no wedding was planned, no beds warmed, the courtship expired like stale bread. No shame, no court, no public shaming. Just an end. Of course, that's the ideal. In practice, things got messy. If one party felt misled, or if a rival swooped in, the spurned suitor could accuse the other of false promises or theft of reputation. These weren't just romantic squabbles. They were legal disputes. One man claimed a woman had given him eyes at a festival, then accepted his gifts for 3 seasons before marrying his cousin. He brought her family to court, claiming emotional theft. The elders dismissed it, but the story stuck. She became known as the promise breaker, and her next suitor came with half the usual dowry. But sometimes, the 1 year rule was subverted entirely. Lovers who couldn't wait would marry in secret, hoping to make it official before discovery. If caught, they might be fined. If children were involved, things became more complicated. One case involved a woman who claimed to have been tricked by a false promise of marriage. She became pregnant, and when the man denied her, she brought a lock of his hair plucked from his beard during their last meeting as evidence. The court believed her. He paid her 2 cows and a goat, and was required to help raise the child, publicly. Everyone remembered. But not all stories end in bitterness. Some lovers waited the year, walked the line, earned the blessing of their families. They married in spring, when the rivers thawed and the sheep were birthing, and their weddings were feasts of optimism. One saga tells of a couple who waited 2 years, due to a plague and a bad harvest. They were mocked at first. Too slow, people whispered. Too cautious. But they outlived 3 other marriages in their village. The last line of their tale says simply, they chose well. You imagine that moment now, 2 people staring at each other across a smoky longhouse, knowing that the clock is almost up. One final winter to prove themselves. One final storm to survive. After that, they either become a unit or they vanish from each other's futures. No dating apps, no ghosting. Just a hard stop, sanctioned by law and memory. And yet, even with that structure, desire found its own pace. Some people used the year to sneak off together, building intimacy in barns and fishing huts. Others barely spoke, treating the process like a business merger. Some couples grew closer with each passing moon. Others drifted apart, realizing that what they wanted wasn't the person, but the idea of them. There's a fringe tidbit about a woman who broke off her courtship in month 11 because she dreamed her suitor would die young. When he drowned the following spring, she was accused of sorcery. She said only, "I listened to what the land whispered." No charges were filed. Historians still argue whether the 1-year rule was empowering or restrictive. Some call it a form of social control, designed to prevent scandal and keep lineages clean. Others say it gave people an escape route, a way to test love without total commitment. Both might be true. But what's undeniable is that it added stakes. Every moment mattered. Every word could tip the balance. And in a society that valued both legacy and reputation, choosing a partner wasn't just personal, it was political. You stand now, empty cup in hand, nodding politely as the older brother makes a joke about your boots. The father eyes you like livestock. The sibling stares at you like a puzzle they're not sure they want to solve. And across the room, your would-be partner glances up, just once, just enough. A flicker, a breath, a maybe, and that's all you need. 11 months to go, you hear the baby before you see it thin. New cries carried across the yard like a warning and a promise, sharp. Enough to cut through fog. The mother is sitting on a fur-lined bench, face pale with exhaustion, arms trembling as she holds the bundle against her chest. Around her, the air feels too quiet. No cheering, no feast, no blessing spoken aloud. Because in this moment, no one is certain if the child is legitimate. And in medieval Iceland, that question is everything. Illegitimacy isn't just a stain, it's a sentence. But here's the twist. Being born outside of wedlock doesn't mean you'll be unloved. It just means your life will start with a trial. The laws are clear, and the stakes are steep. If the father doesn't acknowledge the child, there are no inheritance rights. No claim to land, no seat at the table. You're a shadow, a maybe, a body with no official history. But if he does acknowledge you, if he stands up and says, "That is my child," then the world shifts. Suddenly you have a name that matters. You have a future. And all of it hinges on whether a man is willing to speak. Imagine it. You're 16, wrapped in linen, standing at the edge of a field while two older men debate whether your existence fits into their family tree. You don't speak. You don't get to. Your mother is inside, watching from the window, holding her breath like it's the only power she has left. One of the men spits into the dirt. The other sighs. Finally, someone nods. And just like that, you become someone. Not because you did anything, but because he said your name. That act naming was sacred. In a society where oral tradition was stronger than parchment, having your father's name meant you existed beyond the moment. It meant the sagas would remember you. It meant you could claim livestock, defend yourself in court, and marry without shame. But it wasn't always given. Sometimes fathers refused, denied the child, called the mother a liar, claimed the timing didn't add up, and in those cases, the mother had to fight. She could bring evidence, witnesses, gifts exchanged, love letters. Etched into bark, tokens left behind. In one remarkable case, a woman presented a carved bone comb engraved with both their names and the words, "In warmth we trusted." The court ruled in her favor. The man was fined and the child legitimized. But not every story ends with justice. Many women, especially those without powerful kin, were ignored. Their children grew up half invisible. Some used their parentage as a weapon. One man, considered illegitimate his entire life, rose to power as a traitor. At the peak of his success, he returned to his home valley and challenged the son of his father's official wife to a duel. When asked why, he said, "He got the name, I took the future." He won, left the land untouched. Just wanted the right to say he could. But there were also fathers who chose to acknowledge quietly, tenderly. A saga tells of a man who placed his newborn son's foot into a patch of earth and whispered a blessing. No audience, no court. Just a simple act of recognition. He died 3 weeks later, but that child grew up to be a poet. His verses praised a father who gave no gold, but gave a name. And what of the community? How did they treat these children? With suspicion often. Illegitimacy wasn't just a legal issue, it was a social one. Neighbors whispered. Potential spouses hesitated. Inheritance disputes lurked like wolves. But sometimes the tide turned. If a child proved exceptional strong, clever, beautiful, the community bent the rules. They'd say things like, the gods choose their favorites, or he must come. From noble blood, success could rewrite shame. But for most, the climb was steep. And for the mothers, steeper still. Women who bore illegitimate children walked a narrow road. Some were pitied, others punished. A few were admired for their defiance, especially if the father was married or powerful. There's a fringe tidbit about a woman who bore 5 sons by different men and raised them all alone. When asked why she never married, she said, "I have what I need. 5 strong backs and no man to command them." Her story became legend. Some called her a witch. Others called her wise. You think about that now, the power of being named, of being seen. It seems so small, so basic, but in this world, it's everything. To be claimed is to be real. To be denied is to vanish. You. Look at the baby again. Its tiny fists waving in protest. Its mouth wide with the rage of a rival. No one speaks yet. The father stands a few feet away, chewing his lip, staring at the child like it might explode. Maybe he's scared. Maybe he's calculating. Maybe he's just a man who made a mistake and doesn't know how to unmake it. And then slowly, he steps forward, takes the child in his arms, says the name aloud. It's not grand, it's not poetic. It's just a whisper, but it's enough. The silence breaks. Someone exhales, and the future begins. The wind slams against the side of the turf house like an angry ancestor pounding to be let in. And you pull your furs tighter, nose buried beneath layers of scratchy wool. The fire's down to its last ember, but no one dares sleep yet, because tonight someone's telling a story. And not just any story, a tale about sex. But not the kind the priests warn you about in sermons. This is wilder, older, whispered with a smile and a sideways glance. This is where folklore begins. In a world where the laws made intimacy legal duty, where the church made it guilt, and where your neighbors made it gossip, the people needed somewhere to put the things they couldn't say out loud. So they did what humans have always done when faced with things too messy, too funny, too raw for daylight. They turned them into stories. Tales where real people blurred into myths, where the bedroom became a battlefield or a shrine, and where acts that once carried fines or shame became part of a legend. And in medieval Iceland, that meant sagas dripping with mischief and metaphor. You hear the voice of the storyteller now, gravelly and warm, curling through the dark like steam from a soup pot. He's talking about a woman who lay with the god Thor disguised as her dead husband. She knew it wasn't him. Thor's hands were too big. His breath smelled of thunder, but she let it happen anyway. Why? Because in the story, she wanted to feel powerful for once. And in letting herself be deceived, she reclaimed control. No one in the room laughs. They just listen. And maybe they think of someone they once touched and called by another name. The line between reality and folklore is thin in Iceland. A woman sleeps with a stranger on the edge of a glacier. Next morning, he's gone. But her child grows up with ice-colored eyes and uncanny strength. A man lies with his brother's wife by mistake during a foggy feast, and their child speaks in riddles. These aren't just bedtime stories. They're ways to explain the unexplainable. Ways to soften the hard edges of scandal, or to hide it in plain sight. Historians still argue whether many of the sagas were true accounts twisted by memory, or pure invention shaped by cultural need. But the effect is the same. They allow the unspeakable to be spoken. They give shape to the forbiddens. And often, they do it with humor. One famous tale involves a man who is cursed to uncontrollably seduce every woman he speaks to. He tries silence. He tries hiding. Eventually, he becomes a hermit who communicates only by blinking. But his blinks are so sultry that 3 milkmaids fight over who gets to wash his clothes. His solution? He moves to Greenland. That story has been told and retold for centuries, usually with a chuckle and a shake of the head. But under the comedy is a strange truth. Sexuality, when untamed by law, becomes absurd. It becomes myth. There's a fringe tidbit about a wandering poet who claimed to be able to seduce anyone by reciting a single verse. He challenged a village to test him, and the local chieftain's daughter agreed, on the condition that he speak the verse while doing a handstand. He did. She laughed so hard she married him out of respect. Real? Maybe, but the story lives, and that's what matters. You start to notice how many of these tales are centered on people who bend or break the rules, but not with malice, with style, with cleverness. The woman who tricks her husband into thinking he's sleeping with her sister so she can get pregnant before he sails off to die at sea. The man who pretends to be celibate to avoid a forced marriage, only to reveal, decades later, 5 children. Scattered across the fjords. These aren't villains. These are folk heroes, survivors. You can almost hear the smirk in the storyteller's voice when he gets to the punchline. And from that day forward, no one looked at the butter churn the same way again. Laughter ripples around the room, not loud, not crass. Just warm, familiar, relieved. Because for a moment, the pressure's gone. You're not a wife who has to lie there dutifully. You're not a husband expected to perform despite frostbite. And fear. You're not a law waiting to be broken. You're just a listener, a believer. Someone soothed by the idea that even in a world of rigid codes, there were always those who wriggled free. And these stories? They weren't just escape. They were instruction. They taught young people how to interpret gestures, how to read subtext. They offered guidance with a wink instead of a sermon. Instead of saying, "Don't," they said, "If you do, be clever." A warning and a blessing. One of the oldest preserved folktales tells of a girl who sleeps with a boy from the next valley, even though their families are feuding. She hides the affair for years, then reveals it at a wedding feast by singing a song so beautiful no one can be angry. She's exiled, but she becomes a legend. Later generations call her the one who sang her sins away. You think of her now, her voice echoing over wind and stone. What gave her the courage? Maybe it was the stories she heard. Maybe it was knowing that sometimes the most human parts of us live best in fiction. Outside, the wind begins to fade. The fire cracks one last time. The storyteller leans back, voice gone quiet. He doesn't say goodnight. He doesn't need to. The tale has ended, but its truth lingers like warmth in the sheets after someone's gone. You turn onto your side, heart heavy with something you can't name. Maybe guilt, maybe longing, maybe just the sense that even now, centuries later, we're still telling the same stories, still trying to turn our messes into myths. And maybe, just maybe, that's what keeps us human. The floorboards creak beneath your feet as you step over a sleeping dog, past a snoring cousin, and into the chill of the pre-dawn dark. You're not sneaking out, you're counting. Counting in your head, the names, the faces, the bodies you've held, or that have held you. Some are foggy, others sharp. Some with names you said out loud, others you never knew. And in the heavy silence of the turf house, you wonder, do the others keep count too? In medieval Iceland, your body count wasn't just a private matter, it was public currency. Who you'd slept with, how many, when, and why could affect your social standing as tangibly as your herd size or sword collection. But here's the twist. More didn't always mean worse. In some cases, it meant more power, if you were a man. For men, a high number of lovers could be interpreted as charm, experience, even ambition. A well-traveled man with tailies in every town was considered worldly, dangerous, perhaps, but desirable. One saga tells of a man who'd had lovers in every valley from Reykjanes to the East Fjords, and when he finally settled down, his wedding was so well attended that people came just to count how many former lovers showed up. The tally was 13, including one nun and a merchant's wife. He was applauded, toasted, immortalized in verse. But for women, of course, the math worked differently. A woman with many lovers was a problem to solve, a reputation to manage. Her experience was interpreted not as social finesse, but as moral weakness unless she wielded it skillfully. There are rare but striking examples of women who used their sexual history to gain influence, not in spite of it, but because of it. One woman, known only as Astrid the Bold, was said to have shared beds with chieftains, poets, and even a foreign sailor. She never married. She never apologized. When asked if she feared judgment, she reportedly said, "Let those who've tasted salt water worry about storms." She became a midwife, a matchmaker, a keeper of secrets. And though some whispered, many sought her advice. Because in a world where sex could ruin you, anyone who survived it unscathed was worth listening to. Still, the risks were real. 2. Many lovers, or the wrong one at the wrong time, and the consequences could echo for decades. Especially if children were involved. Especially if reputations were at stake. And the rumors. Oh, the rumors. In a society where everyone knew your genealogy back 10 generations, adding the wrong name to your list could result in exile, duels, even blood feuds. There's a fringe tidbit about a man who challenged his cousin to a holmgang, not because of stolen land, but because of a casual confession that they'd both slept with the same woman. The duel ended with one man dead and the woman forced to flee to Norway. She opened a tavern there and never spoke of Iceland again, and yet there was nuance. Sex before marriage wasn't uncommon. What mattered was discretion. Did your family approve? Did the community tolerate it? Were you careful? Clever? If you managed your liaisons with enough tact, you could emerge relatively unscathed. Some even turned their romantic histories into performances literally. Skaldic poets often used double meanings and metaphors to recount conquests in verse, veiling real encounters in mythic language. One poem describes a woman as a summer mist that visited my field before the first frost. It doesn't take a scholar to decode that one, but even coded, everyone knew. And in knowing, they judged, or they admired, or they waited for their turn. Because beneath the moral codes was something deeper, a fascination with experience. People respected wisdom, earned through risk. They feared it too, which is why some women played up their chastity while hiding a far more complex truth. There's a tale of a widow who claimed to be untouched since her husband's death. When questioned, she said, "I've shared no man's bed." Technically true, she always invited her lovers to the hayloft instead. Word got out eventually, but by then, she'd become a local legend. Farmers claimed their milk tasted better after sleeping in her barn. Whether true or not, no one stopped visiting. The community, it turns out, could be surprisingly forgiving if the story was good enough. But there were limits. Patterns mattered. A young man who seduced too freely risked being labeled unreliable. A woman who switched partners mid-courtship might be accused of manipulating the system. And once that label stuck, it was nearly impossible to scrub away. One couple who had both been deemed too experienced were denied blessing by the local gogi. They married anyway, without ceremony, under a tree during a thunderstorm. Their child grew up to be a lawkeeper, poetic maybe, but also a reminder that not everyone waited for permission. You lie back now, tracing names into the fur blanket with your finger, wondering which ones shaped you and which you barely remember. Not all left a mark, not all deserved one, but some. Some return in dreams, in muscle memory, in the way you flinch when someone touches your shoulder just so. That's the strange thing about body count in this world. It's not just arithmetic. It's archaeology. Every name you carry tells a story, not just of who you were with, but who you were. Were you reckless, curious, desperate, in love? It all matters, and it all lingers. Not just in gossip or law, but in the way you see yourself when you're alone. Outside, the wind changes. A new scent on the air, peat smoke, snow may be longing. You turn over, pulling the blanket up to your chin, heart heavy with old names and new questions. How many is too many? How many is enough? And in a world where love is weighed against reputation, can you ever really win? The scream breaks the air like a blade across ice, sharp, sudden, and unmistakably human. Not the scream of pain, not quite, and not quite terror either. It's the kind of sound someone makes when their world tilts just far enough to know they'll never see it the same again. You sit upright in your bed of straw and wool, heart pounding, and though you don't know the details yet, you know this much: something went wrong. And not in the field, not in the stable, in the bed, again. Because in medieval Iceland, the question of consent wasn't always about a scream. It was about whether the silence afterward counted as survival or surrender. Whether you could say no, and if you did, whether anyone cared. The laws were clear, in the way that vague things are always clear. Forced intercourse, especially outside of marriage, was punishable. On parchment, at least. But the parchment doesn't show you the faces. It doesn't show you the bruises no one asks about. It doesn't account for power dynamics or isolation, or what happens when your no is swallowed by the wind or muffled by obligation. You see, consent in this world wasn't framed in language of freedom. It was framed in property. A woman belonged to her family until she was handed to her husband. Her body was negotiated like a tract of grazing land, valuable, transferable, useful. Once married, she was expected to submit, unless there was cause, illness, penance, the occasional divine vision. If she refused without cause, she could be brought to court. If he refused her, same. Sex was transactional, legal, duty-bound, and yet this cold contract didn't eliminate the human beneath it. People still wanted, feared, loved, resisted. And in that tangled mess, the question of consent whispered from the shadows. One saga speaks of a girl betrothed against her will. Her father said the match would end the blood feud. She said she would rather die. He laughed. She married. And on her wedding night, she bit her new husband's shoulder until he bled. He left her alone for 3 months. When asked why he didn't force the issue, he said, "She has more fire than frost. I prefer not to be burned." They never touched again. She became a priestess. Some call it a victory. Others call it the start of a different kind of prison. Historians still debate whether Icelandic women had more autonomy than their European sisters. Some point to the legal avenues available to them: the right to divorce, to own property, to speak at court. Others argue that these rights were theoretical at best, reserved for the elite, the well-connected, the lucky. But the stories tell us something law books cannot: that resistance existed, and so did retaliation. That people navigated a minefield of cultural expectation and personal dread. That silence wasn't always agreement. Sometimes it was survival. You hear of women who found subtle ways to reclaim power: refusing to bathe with their husbands, moving to sleep with the children, taking pilgrimages. In one case, a woman declared a vow of celibacy after a dream she claimed came from St. Bridget. Her husband protested. The court allowed it, the town murmured, but she held her line, and lived another 20 years without a summons or a slap. Was she saintly? Clever? Just exhausted? No one knows. But her name made it into the scrolls. And that means something. Still, for many, there were no visions to save them. Just cold nights, rough hands, and the pressure to smile through it. One fringe tidbit tells of a man who trained his wife to hum a lullaby whenever she was willing, so he wouldn't waste time guessing. She stopped humming after 2 years. He took a second wife. She started humming out of spite, and the second wife eventually left. Some stories are too cruel to be fiction. Others blur so much you wonder if the cruelty was the point. Like the tale of the farm girl who lay with her employer's son. She claimed it was love. He claimed it was drunkenness. She got pregnant. He denied everything. The child was born sickly. She named it after the mountain behind their house, cold, jagged, beautiful, and unreachable. When it died, she sang it into the ground. The boy became a priest. He never married. You think of her now, standing alone in the frost, hair wild, arms full of silence. Was she a victim, a warning, or just another woman no one believed? Consent wasn't just a matter of law, it was reputation. If you said yes too easily, you were impure. If you said no too loudly, you were a problem. If you said nothing, people filled in the blanks however they liked. And the blanks became your truth. That's why some learned to weaponize reputation. A woman scorned might claim violation. A rival wife might hint at unusual bruises. Sometimes it was revenge. Sometimes it was justice. Sometimes both. There's a saga with a line so chilling, it survived centuries untranslated. Her mouth said no, but her silence brought winter. No one agrees what it means, but everyone agrees it means something. You lie back down, eyes wide open, the scream still echoing in your chest. Somewhere out there, someone's world just shifted. Maybe they'll speak. Maybe they'll stay silent. Maybe no one will ask. But tonight, you understand something deeper. That in a world where sex was supposed to be a legal exchange, the reality was messier, darker, more human. And consent? It wasn't a rule, it was a gamble. One that not everyone survived. The door slams. Not the wind this time. This slam has intent. It has punctuation. It has years of resentment compressed into one wooden bang that rattles the mugs and silences the room. You don't need to ask what happened. You already know. They finally had enough. And in medieval Iceland, that means one thing. The marriage is ending. Not through screaming or walking out or therapy. Through law, through the wing. Through a formal complaint that says, in effect, I've been wronged and I want out. And here's where things get interesting, because contrary to modern assumptions about medieval marriages being lifelong traps, Icelandic law allowed for divorce. Real, legal, and surprisingly accessible divorce. Especially if your spouse wasn't pulling their weight. And yes, that included in the bedroom. You shift your weight, thinking of all the cold nights and colder mornings, the silences, the dutiful grunts passed off as affection. It wasn't always cruelty. Sometimes it was simply absence. Emotional, physical. And here, in this land of stone and salt and sagas, that was enough. If you could prove that your spouse had failed in their obligations, sexual, financial, or emotional, you could leave, with property, with dignity, with legal recognition that the bond had been broken. And it happened more often than people think. One of the more dramatic examples recorded involves a woman who stood at the entrance to her turf house, holding her husband's belt, yes, his literal belt, and declared before 3 witnesses that she was done. Why the belt? Because it was personal, it was his. And the law required a symbolic gesture to accompany the spoken declaration. She listed her grievances like verses in a saga: neglect, harshness, failure to satisfy. The neighbors nodded. The court agreed. She kept the sheep in the south field. He moved 2 valleys away and never remarried. Historians still discuss that case. Not because it was rare, but because she did it with style. Divorce wasn't seen as sin. It was seen as solution. And when a couple split, the focus wasn't on blame, it was on balance. Who owed what? Who wronged whom? Could it be fixed? And if not, how would the assets be divided? Land, tools, children, cows all had to be accounted for. And the most intimate grievances were part of the equation. If a man failed to please his wife consistently, over time, with witnesses or credible complaint, she could leave. If a woman refused her husband without cause, same. It wasn't always equal, but it wasn't impossible. One saga tells of a husband who tried to divorce his wife after a year of what he called coldness. She showed up to court with 3 neighbors who testified to hearing nightly activity. Loud, vigorous, and according to one older woman, not the sounds of someone unwilling. The court ruled against him. She stayed in the house. He built a shack next to the river and fished alone until the ice returned. Some found the system empowering. Others found it humiliating. But almost everyone feared the exposure. Because bringing the case meant opening your life to public scrutiny. It meant neighbors weighing in on your habits, your hygiene, your moans. You didn't just lose a spouse, you risked losing your story. That's why some couples opted for quiet separation. No court, no complaint. Just a gradual move toward different beds, then different houses. It was slower, less official, but sometimes kinder. Still, others chose the stage. There's a fringe tidbit about a woman who declared her divorce in verse. She stood at the door with her hand on the lintel and sang, "This bed is cold, this hearth is ash, I take my name and leave your past." People still recite it at weddings as a joke, as a warning, as a reminder that love, like law, has terms and conditions. And what about the children? They were considered in the settlements, often split, sometimes alternated between seasons, occasionally left to choose once they were old enough. Some parents even remarried within months, blending households before. The court ink had dried. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't rare. Divorce didn't mean ruin. It meant change. And change, while uncomfortable, was not unthinkable. The Icelanders had a word for this kind of resilience, rad. It meant resourcefulness, but also counsel, wisdom, strategy. The ability to adapt, to solve, to move forward without losing your name. That's what divorce was. A strategic reset, a recalibration, not a collapse. You think of your own relationship now, the weight of it, the cracks, the quiet sadness that's become the default. Could you leave? Would you? What would you say at the door, with the belt in your hand, or the verse on your tongue? What would your neighbors say? Would they nod? Would they whisper? Would they understand? Maybe, maybe not. But the idea is there, now sitting beside you like a second presence in the bed. Divorce isn't modern, it's ancient. And in Iceland, it wasn't scandal. It was survival. You roll onto your side, eyes open, heart racing. The fire has died, the house is still. But the future, suddenly, is louder than the silence. The snow falls differently today, soft, hesitant, like it knows this is the last page of something. You stand just outside the longhouse, breath steaming, boots crunching lightly across frozen moss. The cold doesn't bite the way it used to. Or maybe you're just used to being bitten. Behind you, the hearth still burns, but it feels like a relic. Now, you've walked through every law, every whisper, every bed creak and court ruling. You've heard the moans faked out of duty, the sighs disguised as prayer, the silence that shouted louder than any scream. And still, something pulls at you. Not just the facts, the rituals, the absurdity. It's what the laws forgot. Because for all the rules carved into bone and bark, all the clauses about frequency and satisfaction, and who owes who what for how much sex or the lack of it, there's something that no court could quite capture, the quiet rebellions. The longing that didn't make it to parchment. The choices made in glances, not documents. The women who sang their sorrows into lullabies, and the men who touched too gently to be written down. History forgets them because they didn't shake. The system, they bet around it, survived it. They're the spaces between the laws, the invisible ink in the sagas, the truth that slips through when no one's listening. You picture the girl who married at 14 and ran away at 15, leaving a single carved spoon behind. They say she crossed the sea disguised as a man and never looked back. You picture the boy who loved his friend too much and never married, claiming his heart belonged to the gods. He died at 30, with a smile on his lips and a secret buried deeper than his bones. You picture the couple who fought every day for 20 years, then died hours apart still touching. The law didn't know what to make of them, so it ignored them, but they lived anyway. They loved anyway. Somehow, this was never about just sex. It was about being seen, being claimed, being chosen again and again, even when your hair thinned and your teeth fell out and your body didn't obey like it once did. It was about lying beside someone in the dark and knowing you weren't just a legal obligation. You were a person, warm, wanting, fallible. Maybe you weren't kissed often. Maybe you weren't held right. Maybe you never told anyone what you really needed, but you existed. And that matters more than any saga ever dared to admit. Historians still argue over the spirit behind Iceland's sex laws. Were they progressive? Oppressive? Were they tools of control or compromise? The answer, like everything, is yes. They tried to shape behavior, but they couldn't touch the heart. They pretended that intimacy could be measured like milk or sheep, that affection could be legislated. But people are slippery. People cheat systems. They fall in love with the wrong bodies. They fall out of love with the right ones. They stay. They leave. They lie. They hope. And all of that happened here, under the ash roofs and between the straw-stuffed mattresses, long before modernity taught us to call it complicated. You close your eyes now, listening to the wind pull its long exhale across the valley. Somewhere, a goat bleats. Somewhere, a child laughs. Somewhere, a woman stares into the fire, wondering whether tonight will be the night she stops pretending. And somewhere else, a man hums the song his lover once sang while braiding his hair, before duty turned them into strangers. This is what the laws forgot. Not the axe, but the ache. The ache of wanting more than permission. The ache of wanting to be wanted without schedule. The ache of being human. And that's what stays with you, now not the courtroom drama, or the belt on the threshold, or the ridiculous clauses about fasting days. It's the moments no one could write down. The ones too small to matter, too huge to forget. The touch beneath the table. The glance across the hayfield. The kiss that tasted like frost and apology. So here we are, at the end of the path, still holding that ache. Not for the past, but for each other. For what it means to matter beyond law, beyond obligation. Just for the sheer stupid miracle of being seen and loved. Or at least remembered. And now, as the snow settles quietly on the roof and the fire burns low into the hush of night, your breath slows. You've made it through sagas and silences, through duty and desire, through laws that tried to shape love like clay, but only managed to press their fingerprints into the surface. You've seen how even in a world where intimacy was regulated like livestock, people still found ways to reach for one another, sometimes with trembling hands, sometimes with defiance, sometimes with grace. You've walked alongside couples who were strangers to each other by dawn, and others who stayed even when everything fell apart. You've sat beside courtrooms and bathhouses, watched names rise in scandal and fall into folklore. And now, the stories dim. The voices soften. The past curls around you not like a weight, but like a blanket rough, maybe, but familiar. Something you carry not to be haunted by, but to remember how much we've always tried to feel something real, even when the world told us how we should not. So close your eyes now, and let the images fade. The smoke curling from a turf chimney, the glint of moonlight on frost, the creak of a shared bed, a whispered name in the dark. Let it all slip gently away, knowing that beneath the centuries, beneath the myths and the judgments, the same old heartbeats still echo. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, dream strange, and wake with a little more curiosity than before. End of script. Sweet dreams.